Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Cliff Ransom. I'm the managing editor of partnerships at Springer Nature. We are one of the world's largest publishers of scientific research, and I'm really honored to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for joining this Falling Walls Circle Table discussion. These discussions are known to tackle complex issues and promote lively dialogue. I can guarantee that today we will have plenty of both. The name of this session is Vaccine Distribution in the Geopolitical Context. Honestly, as an American, I'd like to forget about politics for just a little while. Clearly, that is wishful thinking on my part. The fact is, healthcare and politics are inextricably bound. The bigger the healthcare challenge, often the more political, or at least politicized, the issue becomes. If you want proof of that, just take a look at the front page of any global newspaper today. The US election will largely be determined by people's opinions of COVID-19. So here's the big question for us today. What happens when you add vaccines for COVID-19, into such a charged and divisive environment? Will they be seen as a global common good, or will they be seen as a strategic asset? Will nations share and share alike, or will they hoard and stockpile and create a system of haves and have-nots? In the next hour, we'll try to address some of these questions. Audience, I'm looking at you. Please keep in mind you have a chat box available at your disposal. It's there for your use. Please use it. We'll be taking questions at the end and as is appropriate during the session. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. We have with us today some of the leading experts on this subject, coming from a range of different backgrounds. Hi, panelists. Give a wave. Hello. Good, good. So panelists, please wave also when I mention you, just so everybody knows who everybody else is. That would be great. Helga Barth is the Director of Human Rights, International Development, Health and Social Affairs at the German Federal Foreign Office. Among other things, she coordinates the foreign policy dimension around global health issues at the ministry. So Helga, you're there, but we can only see, I don't know, just the top of your head. If you could just tilt your screen a little bit, that would be great. Maybe just a tiny bit more when you're ready. All right, we're good. So Helga, welcome. Next in line, we have Tobias Collar. Tobias is the head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Germany. He oversees the foundation's initiatives in country, which of course includes a robust effort on COVID-19. Welcome, Tobias. Thank you for being here. Next in line, we have Professor Ilona Kickbush. Hi, Ilona. She is the founder and chair of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. There, Ilona advises countries on their global health strategies and trains specialists and diplomats in global health diplomacy. Somehow, in her spare time, she also manages to be a member of the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness and Monitoring Board. So welcome, Ilona. Thank you for being here. Kate O'Brien, last but certainly not least, is the director of the Department of Immunization, Vaccines, and Biologicals at the World Health Organization. Among other things, she is the director and technical lead of the ACT Accelerator at WHO, of which the COVAX facility is a big part, and we will be discussing COVAX, I'm sure, at length in this discussion. So everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. Obviously, the elephant in the room, the world is in flux right now. Certainly, we Americans have been in a state of disorder, and I know those outside America are keeping a close eye on what happens. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, for certain. But before we do, I'd like to set a baseline of understanding for the audience. Not everybody might be as fluent on these issues as our panel. So here's how I'm going to ask we do that. To the panelists, I'm going to ask you 5 questions. You can only answer yes or no. This is a binary decision. I promise you that no one is going to hold you to your answers. Some of these things are unknowable. This is just a good way to get us all on the same page. And frankly, when the world is in flux, it's good to be on the same page. So, for yes, raise your hand. For no, shake your head. Are you guys ready to roll? Yes, there we go. Thanks, Tobias. All right, that was good. Question number 1. Do you think we will have an approved vaccine for broad distribution in the first half of 2021? Okay, good. Following that first vaccine, whenever it comes, do you expect to see more vaccines gain approval and come to market? Okay. Question number 3. Do you expect that those various vaccines will come from different countries, different companies, and will be based on different technologies when they arrive? Okay. Would it be fair to characterize the rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine as one of the largest health initiatives the world has ever known? Okay, all right, good. Finally, if a vaccine were approved yesterday, as a certain former and potentially future US president promised it would be, would we as a planet be capable of rolling it out tomorrow, equitably, around the globe to frontline healthcare workers and at-risk patients? All right, lots of head shaking. Fabulous. Thank you guys for playing along in that exercise. I think it's really important to establish that baseline. In an audience, I think what we saw, for the most part, some dissenters. Vaccines are coming, likely soon. There will be a bunch of them, probably based on different technologies and coming from different places of origin. Distributing them, I think we can agree, will be a monumental task, probably one of the bigger tasks we'll face in public health. And it seems that there's a pretty universal agreement that we're not entirely prepared to do that. So those are the facts. That's where we're starting this discussion. Now let's talk a little bit about the geopolitics of the situation. Ilona, I said to you earlier when we were kind of warming up for this session, I don't really want this to be about the US election. This session is meant to be about vaccine distribution in the geopolitical context. But the fact of the matter is, you're a scholar of politics. You train diplomats. There was an election last night, so I really have to ask, how does political uncertainty impact our ability to successfully and equitably distribute a vaccine?
Well, in general, of course, we are facing a very difficult situation in global health because the still American president has decided he would leave the World Health Organization, and therefore that means the United States is also not joining a whole range of initiatives that relate to COVID-19 and fighting it around the world. So, for example, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, the United States has not joined the COVAX initiative. So that is one of the dimensions that is making global health people very nervous. The other candidate has said he would join the World Health Organization, in quotes again, or I should say not leave, because there are dates that are set here. But in general, in this whole debate, there has been a geopolitical competition. The United States has withdrawn. On the other hand, China has said it would enter the fray with $2 billion to help the world fight COVID. We've not seen those yet. But there is a constant upmanship. There are various forms of vaccine nationalism. There are, on the other hand, statements by other partners that they would ensure that the vaccine is a global common good. So what we can see that is this whole global health debate that used to be in other parts of politics has actually entered not only foreign policy, not only geopolitical strategies, but also G7, G20, heads of states, positioning and negotiation. And the minute we have a vaccine, we will see even more of that.
I'd like to sort of follow up on that with you, Tobias. Lona, you brought up the idea of kind of the competing philosophies, multilateral versus bilateral, let's say, for the sake of argument. Can you, Tobias, maybe lay out the debate between multilateral and bilateral approaches to vaccine distribution? Like, those are big words. What do they mean in practice?
Yeah, they probably mean different things to different people. But I think generally to think that you can end a pandemic by just taking care of your own country and just taking care of your own people is going to fail. I mean, like climate change, the pandemic will really take the efforts of all nations involved, and not just countries. I mean, we're talking about an effort that doesn't just take the regular multilateral approach. It's a multilateral plus where you need pharmaceutical companies, research organizations, you need the NGO, civil society, and many other actors, including the philanthropy space, to really tackle these challenges, particularly because you need speed. I mean, the longer this takes, every day costs the economy billions of euros, it costs lives and so forth. Now, we have seen many countries doing bilateral deals, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as some of that bilateral vaccines that you secure can also go to low and middle income countries. But I think it's amazing what we have seen against the backdrop that Ilona was just pointing out, a very difficult geopolitical context in which this epidemic is happening, that you have this multilateral approach. And it's great that Kate is here as well to really talk about the ACT Accelerator, the great work that many organizations are doing that have come together in relatively short time. And that may not be perfect, but I think they are doing a really strong job, and that's, I think, where the world needs to unite. And I think there are strong humanitarian reasons for that, because you will be saving more lives if you ensure that the vaccines go to those who need it the most, the elderly, fragile populations, healthcare workers. At the same time, there are strong economic arguments to that as well, that if this planet unites and ensures that LMICs are getting the vaccine too in an early space, we are saving trillions of US dollars over time.
Yes, and I'd like to sort of actually, you mentioned Kate in that context. Kate, in some of our conversations in the past, we've talked about a couple things that Tobias mentioned: timing, speed, but most importantly, the need for equitable distribution of vaccines. Can you describe, or can you follow up on what Tobias said about why equitable vaccine distribution is so important?
Sure. I think the first thing that we really all need to focus on is what are we trying to do with vaccines? The reason that we're in the situation that we're in is I'll say something a little bit controversial, but I want to make sure I get into the detail of it. It's not really that it's a pandemic. It's that it's a pandemic of a severe disease. If this was a pandemic of something that was mild, that an infectious disease that caused a skin rash that resolved in 2 or 3 days, we would not be having the measures that we are to address the pandemic, which has resulted in the social and economic consequences that 100% of people in countries are feeling. It's the nature of the disease that is resulting in the interventions that have been necessary, the mortality, the severe disease, and that has resulted in healthcare systems being overwhelmed. And as a result of that, the need for the interventions that have been put in place, which if implemented and are implemented with fidelity, actually work. So for a vaccine, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to add to that toolkit and provide more protection for people trying to provide some immunity so that those who are most at risk of mortality, of death, or of severe disease are the first ones that are protected, and that we can protect the healthcare system so that it can serve not only the COVID pandemic itself, but can serve all our healthcare needs, and assure that we don't end up with secondary effects because of a collapse of a healthcare system. So when we sort of zero in on what are we trying to get done with a vaccine in the first place, it doesn't follow that we have to, first of all, immunize large proportions of the population necessarily, but we do in the first instance really need to go and protect through the use of vaccines, added on to the other things that we have, those who are at most risk of serious disease and those who are serving our healthcare systems. And that's why when we're in a supply-constrained environment, which we will be in the initial phases of the vaccine rollout, that every country has the opportunity to protect those people who most need protection, rather than just a few countries having a huge amount of vaccine and protecting up and down the population, both those at high risk and those who aren't at high risk. So that's the need for the equitable distribution. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do from a public health perspective. And I think that's the thing we really need to focus on.
I mean, that's very well said, Kate. Now, I'll actually stick with you really quickly and kind of circle back to the initial question that I asked Ilona. I think we're all in agreement here that equitable distribution of vaccines is the fastest way to mitigate this pandemic and reduce suffering. The issue is that politics sometimes can support that effort, and sometimes it can hinder that effort. How do you think political uncertainty will impact your ability to achieve that goal?
Well, I think what we've seen so far is the COVAX facility, which is the only global mechanism for aggregating supply and then allocating that supply according to fair and equitable allocation principles that WHO has established and has done so in consultation with countries around the world. That's the only global mechanism there is right now, and probably will be the only global mechanism to distribute vaccines on using those principles. And what we've seen in the COVAX facility is an enormous support for that idea. There are now, as I think everybody knows, over 90 countries that are self-financing countries that have committed to the COVAX facility. And that's joined up with 92 countries who will be able to get vaccine in financial support through development support. And so I think when we talk about political uncertainty, there certainly is on the part of some countries. But I really also think that this is absolutely unprecedented. We've never had a mechanism of any sort to actually aggregate funding and aggregate in a decided way that countries will in fact go ahead and sign up for a mechanism where there is an allocation mechanism based on public health principles. So it's true that not every country has committed to this, but I think the number of countries that we've seen that in fact are fully in, and this is representing over 85% of the world's population, is a really strong testament that something is working. And we have to put all our energy behind assuring that it can actually succeed in what it's aiming to do.
That's a powerful statement for multilateralism. I couldn't agree with you more. Helga, I'd like to kind of pick up on that with you. You know, as a member of the German government in the Federal Foreign Office, obviously Germany is participating in the COVAX facility. You've also, I think, agreed or made some bilateral agreements. Maybe I'm wrong about that. You can correct me. Where do you see that? Okay. I'm sorry. I was going to say, where do you see this debate between multilateral and bilateral agreements come down when it comes to vaccine distribution?
Well, the German government certainly shares the perspective of the WHO and Director General Tedros that no one is safe until everyone is safe. But that's also something that governments have to explain to their taxpayers. It's actually in our own interest that not just you and your family are being vaccinated once vaccines are developed. But this happens also for our neighbors, well, within the European Union and people worldwide, and especially people in working in the health sector. So we have to do some explaining about that to find also other reasons for global solidarity. That's actually quite important. And well, Germany has joined COVAX early on, and we have always worked along the words of Chancellor Dr. Merkel about vaccines as a global public good. She has said that early on. She's a natural scientist by training, so she has understood what was in front of us much earlier than many people in government, and of course the population at large. So, but we of course see vaccine nationalisms, and not just in certain countries, but you see that in the public debate. It's not that this is not a case for if everybody thinks about his or her own interest, everybody's interest is secure. But it's rather if you think about others, that's going to help yourself as well. But it's a real case for multilateralism. But we all know that multilateralism is. Well, there's a lot of debate about that, but you certainly see lots of countries acting, sometimes speaking in that direction, but acting in a completely different way.
May I build on Helga's statement there? When Germany, I think, has been a strong contributor to the ACT Accelerator, and just being really strong about, I think, also defending the multilateral approach. I mean, talking about what's in for the taxpayers. So I just saw Rand published some figures on that the rich country, United States, EU member states, etc., may lose over $120 billion a year if the poorest are actually denied an early access to vaccine. And we commissioned a study with Eurasia Group, and they came to a similar conclusion just for Germany, losing more than $4 billion for the economy if LMICs are not receiving that at an early stage. So I think there are also strong economic arguments besides the strong moral one. And of course, Germany is also profiting from a strong rule-based international system. And I think multilateralism and ensuring that certain moral values and orders are upheld as a strong interest and national interest also of Germany and many, actually all EU member states.
Ilona, I'm going to turn to you and ask you a question about sort of vaccine nationalism as relates to what Tobias and Helga just said. I think that, again, we all agree that in theory and in practice, multilateralism is probably the right way to go. Do you see that? Do you see that as a viable option? Do you see, given the political environment today, are you optimistic that these multilateral approaches that we are putting into place are going to succeed, or are they going to face obstacles that we didn't anticipate?
Well, anything one tries to build up anew will face obstacles. That's quite clear. But as some of the previous speakers have said, first of all, there's rarely been such a joint multilateral cooperation in global health as we're seeing right now, particularly around COVAX and the ACT Accelerator, but also in support for WHO. So one of the things we are seeing, and that's what we political scientists deal with, once there's a void, somebody else comes in. And we have seen that, for example, the European Union has played quite a new, very, very proactive role in global health at the World Health Organization, under the German Council presidency, there will be strong Council conclusions in support of multilateralism and the WHO. And of course, it's important to see that this is not only happening in the health sphere, but to remember that particularly middle powers have come together to build the Alliance for Multilateralism. So in a way, we might actually be moving into an interesting paradox where the big powers are to some extent, pulling out, pulling back. And that gives the room for those for whom multilateralism is important, because it's particularly important for middle powers and for smaller countries. And we're experiencing this in COVAX, we're experiencing it in a number of other areas. So I think while there's a feeling at first, the US is not coming and who knows what Russia is doing and all of that, but there are other big countries like India, for example, that are very committed to multilateralism and are very keen to be part of that. So I think we must also look at this geopolitical shift that is going on. And that is a power shift that is not just US-China. It's much more complicated, and it's about the voice of the global South. And it's about countries that so far have not had so much say in global health. And I must say, to some extent, if you look at some of the Asian countries that have been highly successful in dealing with COVID-19, it just shows partly the amount of hubris that certain parts of the world have, that they think they know what to do and don't need to learn from others. So we're in a really dynamic situation, and everyone must work together to use that to actually strengthen multilateralism. And then those that are more in the back right now will have to actually join another type of dynamic system and not just come back and say, oh, I'm going to have my old place again.
Thank you for that. That was actually a really good segue to you, Kate. I think we've been talking about the ACT Accelerator, or we've been talking around the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility. For the benefit of our audience, because I'm seeing a couple questions come in, could we maybe back up one step and describe to the audience what the goal of the ACT Accelerator is and how the COVAX facility actually works?
Sure. The ACT Accelerator's goals are to, first of all, innovate, to create new tools so that they can be distributed in a fair and equitable way to end the pandemic. And there are three parts to the ACT Accelerator. There is work going on vaccines, on therapeutics, and on diagnostics. And we need all three in order to really tackle this pandemic and assure that in every country we can get back to some semblance of normal from our social engagements, our economic livelihoods, and certainly underpinning all of that, as I said before, is the health impact that we're trying to achieve through new diagnostics, new therapeutics, and then vaccines to prevent. And the vaccine part of the ACT Accelerator is referred to as COVAX, COVID vaccines. Apart from these three parts, that's three pillars they're referred to, there is also a health systems part that runs across all three pillars. None of those three commodities can actually be delivered unless there's a health system that functions in which we can deploy diagnostics, where we can actually treat people with new therapeutics, and where we can deliver vaccines to whoever needs them in every country around the world. So the COVAX part of it, the pillar itself that works on vaccines, has three parts to that pillar. And the first part is to create research and development of new vaccines for COVID. Obviously, we don't have any vaccines that have achieved demonstrated impact on disease itself. Those data are still coming. And the second part is to assure that there's fair and equitable access to those vaccines. And the third is to assure that they can be procured and delivered in every country that needs those vaccines. So that's sort of the structure of ACT and what it's working on. And the COVAX facility is this entity. It's a financing facility to aggregate demand, aggregate the countries that want to procure vaccines, and to actually provide those vaccines through that aggregated demand. The really important part of this is there is a race on, as we all know, to develop vaccines that work. And when I say develop vaccines that work, is we want vaccines that actually protect against disease, and ideally not only protect against disease, but also protect against transmitting the infection from one person to the next. So that's the goal of the ACT Accelerator, and the specific goal of the COVAX facility is to assure that there are doses of vaccine that can then be deployed and delivered in a fair and equitable way to all who need it, using public health principles about who needs it first and are the highest priority.
That's very helpful. You brought up the idea of sort of this multitude, or at least a handful of vaccines that will be coming online over the course of the next couple of years. And certainly a lot of nations are looking to build portfolios of those vaccines to hedge their bets. You know, if one works, great. If another doesn't, well, then you've got an alternative. COVAX obviously does this very nicely and at scale, which is really, really interesting. Helga, I'm going to turn to you and ask you a little bit about the German response to building a vaccine portfolio. Obviously, Germany is a strong supporter of the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility signed on. What are you doing as a nation to build out your portfolio of vaccines, to get ready?
Actually, we are acting on several levels. Of course, there is the national one, but Germany, of course, is also part of a European initiative to procure vaccines for the European population, and we have very much supported the EU Commission in their efforts to find and found a bridge to COVAX, investing European taxpayers' money into COVAX and trying to see what amount of vaccines might be a surplus that could be are perhaps being developed within the European Union, but could also be provided for people living outside the European Union. There's a lot of creative thinking going on, and I've actually never followed a political issue that has developed with so many actors so fast. And we've often been asked, since we are coordinating between ministries, we often been asked, well, where's the paperwork? What has the Commission written up about that? And we said, well, they're probably going to do some paperwork, but of course they have the idea. The first comes the idea, and then you need the time to write up what could be our joint next step. And we, of course, especially our Ministry of Health is getting so many requests from countries outside the European Union, whether Germany or the European Union could help with vaccines, because we actually quite worried about the market. Of course, we know there are lots of trials going on, also third phase trials, but rumor has it that a lot of what is going to be manufactured as a vaccine that works and is safe, that the production has been bought up already, either by the US or perhaps by EU member states. it's very difficult to get a clear picture about that. So we sometimes wonder what is there actually, what is going to be there on the market for everybody.
Well, you very nicely anticipated my next question to Tobias, Helga. Thank you for that. You know, Tobias, you work for a pan-national organization, looks across the world. And to echo what Helga said, there are multilateral agreements, there are bilateral agreements. People are getting commitments from various vaccine companies to supply doses. Are we in a situation where we're oversubscribed, undersubscribed? Do we know? How do you plan in a situation like this?
Yeah. I mean, we are still in that phase where nobody really knows what the winning vaccine or vaccines are, right? So it's hard to say which countries have possibly oversubscribed or subscribed or not. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the United States, the UK, European countries, if those vaccines come through, if they are safe, if they're effective, then all of these countries have oversubscribed. And there's a question, of course, how fair is that towards the developing countries, where I think you have a subscription rate of maybe 8% of the population at the moment. COVAX is aiming towards 2 billion over the course of the end of next year to provide at least, those who need it the most, the coverage. And there's, of course, a question, how do you secure that equitable access? Now, I mean, we have been working with many partners, with governments, with research institutions, but particularly I think, and it's too bad we don't have anyone here from the pharmaceutical companies who can explain very well the importance of at-risk investments to, even you don't know yet if your vaccine is going to make it or not, if you get a license or not, that you need to invest already into scaling up the production. And that's quite costly, of course. That's where you need also public investments, and where CEPI and Gavi are coming into play, both really important organizations that the Gates Foundation has been supporting, in terms of Gavi since the beginning 20 years ago, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI since its start in 2017. In terms of the partnership with private sector, with pharmaceutical companies, we have the CEO roundtable with major companies from that space, and they have just signed a communique on global access, and they agreed on a couple of really important points. For example, to ensure that their clinical trials will encompass people from the global south, so to ensure that innovation is really available for everyone. They agreed to timely dissemination, availability. That includes the at-risk investments I was talking about, but also, and I think this is quite unique, that they agreed to share manufacturing spaces in an equitable way, or in a way that makes sense. So one company may have a strong production chain, can actually use the others as well, if they can produce a vaccine in that infrastructure. Affordability makes a huge difference, of course, and they agreed to ensure a low-cost vaccine supply for the poorest countries. There are different mechanisms, maybe donations, it may be tiered pricing, etc. But these are conversations that are ongoing, and I think there's quite a lot of pressure on pharmaceutical companies, not just in terms of succeeding in high speed, with the speed of light, and there's quite a lot of funding behind the R&D efforts. By the way, also especially from the United States, but the collaboration, and I think also the reputation of these companies will hopefully or the pressure on the reputation will also lead that this unique effort will lead to a immense supply of highly effective and safe vaccines in a else unimaginable time frame.
Ilona, I'd love you to kind of build on that. So Tobias mentioned a couple things. He mentioned production, an immense supply, which we all are rooting for, of course. I noticed that you didn't raise your hand when I asked whether we would have an approved vaccine early on or within the first half of this year. So where do we stand on vaccine supply? And how can we ensure that we are going to have a good supply of vaccines when we do have an acceptable candidate?
Well, you see, and Kate has partly referred to that, it's an incredibly complex issue because, first of all, you need the vaccine. And it's interesting that none of the people before have really spoken about the Chinese and maybe the Russian vaccine. I mean, the vaccines are not only coming from the Western pharmaceutical companies, and China maintains that it is quite far advanced and is already promising its African allies access to that vaccine. So it's become part of Chinese health diplomacy. We experienced some of the mass diplomacy before. And if all this also falls into the geopolitical competition, then here too we have issues that Kate referred to of efficacy, of safety, etc., where again collaboration and the role of the World Health Organization will be absolutely critical. So I think that's one part. The other part, of course, that is interesting is that one of the biggest production sites, actually, and that is India, has just gone together with South Africa to the World Trade Organization and has called for a waiver on I'll quote it directly, a WTO waiver from intellectual property protections for COVID-19 related medical technologies. So they don't seem to be too sure that the access will be guaranteed based on the present intellectual property agreements, and also seem to think that the Doha agreements are not sufficient. So, and then on top of that, you have the situation in Africa, where on the one hand, deals are being made. If we can test the vaccine with your population, you will get extra access to it. But even if you have that access, you still need the health systems to be able to take that forward. And you still don't know if the vaccine that makes it is the kind of vaccine that's actually easily distributed. And then, of course, you're not only talking about the vaccine itself, you're talking about syringes, you're talking about glass containers, you're talking possibly about the way you need to build the cold chains. So that's why I'm so hesitant. We might have the vaccine, but how quickly will we really be able to bring it to the people that need it most? And are we investing also in those infrastructures, not only in the vaccine development itself?
Kate, I would love for you to kind of pick up that ball. You've worked all around the world and you are leading, as you said, the world's only global effort to distribute vaccines equitably. Ilona brings up a bunch of good points. I'd love for you to respond to whichever ones tempt your fancy.
Yeah, so the world's attention is really on first, getting vaccines that have been demonstrated to actually do what they're designed to do, to prevent disease. And I think it is important that we really hold the bar at the highest standard. Vaccines are given to healthy people. It's different than when we're talking about therapeutics, which are by definition given to people who are already ill. And so we're absolutely committed to upholding the absolute highest standards of both safety and demonstrated efficacy of vaccines, and very clear metrics for what has to be accomplished in order for a vaccine to meet those measures. And I think we really want to continue to emphasize that from WHO. And any vaccine, wherever it comes from, that meets those standards will be very positively reviewed. And of course, there are three parts that need to happen for a vaccine really to become a vaccine that can be deployed. It has to meet safety measures. It has to be shown to prevent disease. And the third thing that was just referred to is it has to be able to be manufactured. And that means being able to manufacture day in, day out a consistent product that meets all of the technical measures for actually being a vaccine that has been shown to work. And that is not an easy enterprise. Vaccines are different than drugs. Vaccines are biologicals, and that means that the technical needs for making them are higher. There's been quite a bit of talk about IP issues, and I think what we're seeing here is that IP is not the thing that is actually slowing anything down. In fact, we're seeing amazing partnerships like we have not seen before. I think the thing that is the bigger barrier here is producing vaccines at scale and doing so in different regions around the world is really about technical capacity. And you can't just gin up technical capacity to scale at the size of scale that these vaccines are demanding. We also don't want to displace manufacturing capacity for existing vaccines because we have vaccines already for life-threatening diseases, which is why they're of less concern now because we're vaccinating. So I think that's another dimension. I do want to pick up on a couple of things that was just mentioned. I want to emphasize the healthcare workforce. And a vaccine that sits in a refrigerator or in a freezer or on a shelf is of absolutely no use if it's not actually deployed into people. And it takes trained healthcare workers to safely administer vaccines and all the systems that are needed, as was described, the cold chain system, the deployment of the vaccine, the monitoring afterwards as we monitor every product, every vaccine for safety for its lifetime. The cold chain issues have been written about a lot. And I think I just want to kind of temper a little bit where the concerns are. Every country around the world has an immunization program, and every country around the world has a cold chain system for vaccines. These vaccines are, some of them fit well into the characteristics of the cold chain that already exists, a 2 to 8 degree cold chain. We also have -20 vaccines already that need to be stored at that temperature. So we do have to scale up the size of the cold chain to some degree, but it's not necessarily doubling or tripling the size of that cold chain because we're not going to be immunizing everybody in a really, really short period of time because we don't actually have the supply to do that in every country around the world. So really the sort of constraints that we have, some of these are manageable and very manageable in a relatively short time frame. But I think the biggest issue is about something that we haven't spoken about, and that is the demand of people and the confidence of people to actually get whatever vaccines we have coming forward. And that's an area that is of really great concern. I know to many people in WHO, and I'm sure to all of the panelists around the table, because that's something that's really about trust in authority, trust in scientists, trust in the systems. And we've been in a period of a social period where many of those beliefs are threatened and are being undermined. And I think as we face this pandemic, we're also seeing the impact of those social shifts over the past 10 to 20 years that are really impacting the ability of our societies, communities to respond to this pandemic.
I want to thank you for that answer, and also inadvertently you answered one of our audience members' questions about cold chain, so thank you. And audience, if you do have questions, please do file them. I have a handful and we'll do our best to get them to the panelists. But picking up on what you were just saying about confidence in vaccines, Kate, Helga, you had brought that point up tangentially before. What is the German government doing in anticipation to make ready the German population for the arrival of a vaccine? How can we be sure that people will actually take it?
That's a very good question. I think the government tells people has told people many times there will not be an obligation to have yourself to get a shot, because you might have heard that in Germany, but I think in many other countries there are people who have become very nervous about so many immunizations, and they're reluctant to have their kids. They have to have shots for the kids. So it's very important to tell people this is something that's going to be on offer, and it's going to be important, but it's not going to be mandatory. Because you might have heard news about fairly large demonstrations with people without masks, holding up transparents. We don't want these shots, and we don't want Mr. Gates vaccines and all these. I would say all this all this nonsense. And of course we have a federal system. So immunization programs will be organized by the federal lender, by the federal states, and of course by cities and towns. So they have been told to get ready for campaigns, because you can't find a vaccine tomorrow and have the whole population or everybody who signs up for that. For vaccination the day after. This needs to be prepared quite well, and we know that in other EU member states it's actually the same thing. So that is what's happening, and well, we of course don't know which vaccine comes first, but I'd like to mention one step before vaccines are distributed, and that is certification. And there are quite strict regulations within the European Union, and I think all the experts are going to speed up whatever procedures are there. But there needs to be a procedures, because of liabilities and all that. Yeah.
That makes great sense. So we're getting close to the end of our session, and before we leave, I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on some express solutions. Obviously, we've talked about things that are ongoing. The ACT Accelerator, the COVAX facility, other multilateral efforts, efforts within countries to improve vaccine confidence and dissuade vaccine hesitancy. I'm going to ask each one of you panelists if there were two things you'd like to see happen before a vaccine is approved and broadly distributed, what would they be? And Ilona, as ever, I will start with you for a sense of perspective.
Well, I think that's a question I'd like to answer differently. I think as we work right now on all the pressing issues around the vaccines, and of course, one of the most pressing is also to have, first of all, an understanding of the population, what a vaccine means, what it can do, what they can expect, and all the international solidarity issues we've discussed. But I would wish that already now we think more long term. And this is not going to be the last pandemic. The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board has said this continuously. And therefore, I think we need to take this opportunity to actually already now think about a framework agreement on vaccine sharing. We've got to learn from this. We've got to move it forward. And we need to take the issues of trade and investment into account. And therefore, I would urge everyone that is now also involved in the COVAX, in WHO, in the World Trade Organization, to start thinking about such a framework agreement on vaccine sharing, so we're prepared the next time around and don't need the discussions that we are having now.
Kate, I'm going to kick it to you. You're at the coalface here. You're making it happen. You are leading the global effort. If there were two things that needed to happen before the approval of a broadly distributed vaccine, what would they be?
Well, if I had my wish list here, so I really want to endorse what Ilona just said, which is I just want to put sort of a little punctuation point on that, because we've been around the mulberry bush on this once before with the influenza pandemic, and so this is sort of the second crack at the bat on a vaccine of limited supply that has global implications. And extraordinary work has been done in an absolutely unprecedented short amount of time to stand up, amazing collaborations to make vaccines, to test vaccines, and to put all of these elements in place. But we shouldn't be initiating this and making this up for the next pandemic, for the next emergency. There will be one. We all know that it will happen again at some point in some dimension. So I really want to emphasize what she said. The two I would ask for, one is rather sort of self-oriented on vaccines, and one is actually more outward-looking. The first is I would really hope for, if I had a magic wand, that people around the world had much greater, I'm going to call it vaccine literacy. I think that it's so important that people understand what vaccines do, what they can do. The vaccines that we're going to have for COVID, really think we need a sort of sobriety test here. They're not going to be 100% effective. Almost no vaccine is. And so I do have concern that the public has, I want the public to have a really sort of sensible view of the importance of the vaccines, but not an outsized, unrealistic point of view of what they will be able to achieve. So that's maybe my first one, is a public that has readiness to receive to receive these vaccines, and to appreciate what they can do and what they're not going to be able to do, at least in the first instance. And then the second one is not specific about the vaccines. Actually, I'd like to sort of put more of my public health hat on. And I would wish at this point that people would take more seriously the implementation of the measures we already have. We have enormous tools already to reduce the suffering and the social and economic consequences. And if there was greater fidelity of implementing those measures, I think we would be in a better shape and not going through these cycles of severe increases in cases again. So I think we really need to use every tool that we have: hand washing, mask wearing, physical distancing to the degree that we can. And I think those things would reduce a lot of the impact of what we're going through now.
Great. Tobias, and then Helga, I'm going to come to you as last but not certainly least. But Tobias, quickly, because we're almost at time, what would be your two wishes?
So I think a fully financed ACT accelerator, and as we're talking about vaccines, I think particularly around the Gavi AMC, that all the donors are actually fully financing the needs of the Gavi AMC, which is it's peanuts, the 7 to 8 billion or so that is needed compared to the cost of this pandemic. And then I think just briefly also, let's not forget about all the other needs that least developed countries are facing in this pandemic, and we need to really think about the economic loss and what is their economic stimulus package going forward.
Thank you. And Helga, as I said, last but not least,
and very
things
briefly,
you'd like to see accomplished.
Very briefly, I of course agree with everything that has been said. Especially think about this framework agreement. It's extremely important. I think if I had that magic wand, I would wish for a common understanding that health workers, wherever they are the first to be immunized, and secondly, that we look much closer at therapeutics, so that we're able to help people who cannot be where we don't have the possibility to give them the shot to help them much better to survive the disease. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're at time. We've learned an immense amount. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure the audience did too. And I just want to thank everyone on this panel for being so generous in taking time away from mounting the world's largest global health response to speaking with us. So thank you all very much. And our hearts are with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well.
Thank you.